Thank you for joining us today in this conversation on Israel and Palestine. My name is Ross Wagner, and I belong to a circle of Christian scholars with long experience in the Middle East. We refer to this series as CFIP, or a Christian Forum on Israel and Palestine. Each episode will host a major thinker with professional experience in the subject, and our hope is that these interviews will be fair, stimulating, and take us behind the curtain, so to speak, of current events. These conversations will be live streamed on YouTube and permanently archived there. And so if you subscribe to this channel, you'll be notified when a new episode is coming. Each meeting will present our guest views and then open to a wider conversation with our panel. Today, we're honored to welcome Ali Abunimah, co-founder and executive director of the Electronic Intifada, an award-winning independent online news publication and educational resource founded in 2001 that focuses on Palestine, its people, politics, culture, and place in the world. A Palestinian American, Ali was born in Washington, D.C. His mother is from Lifta, near Jerusalem. She became a refugee in the Nakba of 1948. His father, a former Jordanian diplomat and ambassador to the United Nations, hails from the village of Batir in what is now the occupied West Bank. Ali's informed, insightful, and trenchant reporting appears in a wide variety of print, video, and online publications around the globe. Ali, we are really pleased to welcome you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ross. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. I wonder, just to start out, if you would talk a little bit about the way you came to found the Electronic Intifada and say something about the role that it has played, especially since October 7th.
Well, we founded it, myself and several other co-founders, in 2001, which makes us probably one of the oldest continuous news publications online, at least an independent publication. And we founded it briefly out of a need to have a place for Palestinians and their allies to report and speak about the truth. We started off really reacting to mainstream media coverage, doing media activism. And then we realized that we have this platform where we can start to do our own reporting and analysis. And that's how we started. Since October 7th, we have seen really a record number of people coming to our website. We're primarily a news publication that you can find at the electronicintifada.net or electronicintifada.net. And we also started a live stream in October where every week we have guests and we speak about the situation with the genocide in Gaza. We've been able to host many of our colleagues from Gaza. That's gotten more difficult with just the sheer level of displacement and the difficulty communicating. But we try to always provide a place for people in and from Gaza to speak about their experience and their analysis. And I would say there's two things I'm very proud of. Well, I'm proud of everything we do. I'm proud of my colleagues at the Electronic Intifada who are incredible. But there's a couple of things that really stand out to me. One is, I think nowhere in the English language, at least, will you find every single day people, reporters from Gaza writing about what's going on, telling their stories, telling the stories of their families and those around them. And they're doing so under the most extraordinary circumstances, indescribable. And they communicate with us however they can. It may be by WhatsApp. It may be by traveling a long distance to find a signal to get on email. But they insist on telling their stories. And we're very proud of the work they do and that they trust us to publish it. And the other thing we've done, which I think is very significant, is push back at the lies, the propaganda, the atrocity propaganda that has been told ever since October 7th about what happened that day. I think there's two, we'll talk more about these, but, pushing back against the false claims about what Palestinian resistance fighters did on October 7th, and particularly pernicious is the atrocity propaganda narrative. We can again talk about this more, about claiming that there was sexual violence on October 7th when the evidence shows none at all.
Yeah. Thank you. We will come back to those issues. I'll mention also your work is, many of your videos are on YouTube as well, so people can come to you via electronicintifada.net, or they can search for you on YouTube. Staying out at a little bit wider level for a moment, we're seeing in the last 10 months or so world opinion shifting quite dramatically. There's much more open criticism of Israel's scorched earth campaign in Gaza, not just South Africa, Ireland, Norway, Spain, but also university students in the United States and around the world, American Jews, the UN. I wonder how do you explain this shift? Do you think it's primarily generational? And what impact do you think the Electronic Intifada and other online publications, social media outlets have had in shifting this opinion?
I think the primary credit has to go to people in Gaza themselves. Unfortunately, they are in the position of live streaming their own genocide. And it goes to the reporters in Gaza, Palestinians, because Israel doesn't allow foreign reporters into Gaza. They can't get in. And so it has been Palestinian journalists, professional journalists, and citizen journalists who have shown the world what Israel is doing. And more than 140 journalists have paid with their lives in Gaza, the biggest massacre of journalists in any conflict in modern history, perhaps even at any time in history. And them showing us what has happened has turned the tide. Secondary to that, I think we have played a role, not just we at the Electronic Intifada, but independent media. And I think this shift in opinion is happening despite the fact that mainstream media continue to follow basically the official propaganda narrative. Now, I think that the change has been happening over time, over the last few decades and in the last few years. That base of support for Israel in the United States and in the Western countries generally has been eroding. There has been a generational change. You can see it in poll after poll. I'm talking about in the prior years before October 7th, where you can see that staunch support for Israel shifted from being a pretty broad, let's say, bipartisan phenomenon, if we're talking about the United States, to being concentrated, to becoming, generally speaking, of course, we're talking in terms of averages here, older, whiter, richer, more Christian, more Republican. I realize that might be even some of the audience we're speaking to today, but that's where it's become more concentrated now, and you see a loss of support for Israel in broad swaths of the population. And globally speaking, that support has always been there. But I think the outrage, the horror, the disgust at this genocide that we're seeing, atrocities that people thought could never be repeated in history, let alone for so long, let alone on live television, and the world would just sit back and allow it to happen. We were told never again, and yet it's happening again right before our eyes.
Yeah, thank you. As someone who grew up in the Midwest of the United States in the 1970s and 80s, I'm very familiar with the sort of support for Israel that comes from a place of believing that that this is the one democracy in the Middle East. Coming out of the Cold War, here is America's ally, and yet we're seeing increased attention given, especially since 2018, to the Jewish character of this state. And you've written about this in your book, The Battle for Justice in Palestine, this tension between being supposedly a democracy, but then being a state especially that has a right to exist as a Jewish state, and that primarily exists for the national aspirations of its Jewish inhabitants. I wonder, how do we understand the current war in Gaza in light of this larger um, tension in Israel between wanting to represent itself as a democracy but wanting to guarantee its Jewish character? Are we seeing an opportunity here to solve some of the demographic problems? How do we think about this tension between democracy and Jewish identity? How is that playing out here?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, Israel was founded as a so-called Jewish state, and it could only be a Jewish state if it had a Jewish majority. And the only way it could have a Jewish majority in Palestine was by expelling the vast majority of the population who was not Jewish. They were Palestinian Muslims and Christians. That was the population of Palestine in 1948 on the eve of Israel's founding. And the Jews, who formed less than a third of the population in 1948, were primarily recent settlers who'd arrived from Europe and other countries in the previous couple of decades. So this was a European settler colony. Despite the, let's call it, Jewish flavoring, it was a Jewish settler colony, a European Jewish settler colony, similar to the French Christian settler colony in Algeria, the European settler colony that eventually became the United States, the British settler colony in Australia, New Zealand, so on. And so it defined itself as a Jewish state, and the only way it could be a Jewish state was through mass expulsion, which happened in 1948. That's what Palestinians call the Nakba. And then in the ensuing decades, Israel could only remain a so-called Jewish democracy by violently maintaining this ethnically cleansed, gerrymandered demographic reality, which meant forcibly keeping Palestinians who had been expelled from their homes and their descendants from returning home. Now, despite the ethnic cleansing, despite the measures to suppress the Palestinian population over many decades, eventually the number of Jews willing to move to this settler colony dwindled. So inward migration reached close to zero. I mean, an insignificant number of Jews would be moving from North America or Europe or wherever else every year. Meanwhile, the Palestinian population has been growing a lot faster than the Jewish population, to the point where now Palestinians are once again the majority in Israel, what's called Israel now, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. That's to say historic Palestine. So liberal Zionists, people who consider themselves sort of more dovish or more willing to entertain what they would call peace, always said, look, Israel has this demographic problem, they would call it. I mean, to me, that's an offensive term because it means that Palestinians, just by existing and breathing, are a problem. But I'm using their language. Israel has this demographic problem. The only way we can resolve it is with a two-state solution where Jews maintain Jewish supremacy and control within the Jewish state, and we let Palestinians have their own state, which in every version of the two-state solution endorsed by the United States or by any Israeli party would be a Palestinian state that remains effectively under Israeli control. But that's how they would resolve the problem politically. Give Palestinians their own statelet or Bantustan, as to use the South African apartheid terminology, and the Jews then can legitimize their rule within this smaller Israeli state. The right, which became ascendant and now fully dominates Israel, said, no, we will never allow a Palestinian state. We will never give up control over an inch of historic Palestine between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And then the question was, well, how will you resolve this so-called demographic problem? And their answers were always, we don't have to, because there's no problem. They would just, I mean, there was a whole school of pseudo-demographers whose job was to deny the existence of millions of Palestinians, believe it or not. So that's one approach. It wasn't the mainstream approach. The mainstream approach was to bypass the Palestinians, really to do what they call conflict management. We don't have to give them their rights. We just have to give them work permits, turn on the pressure, turn off the pressure. If they revolt in any way, if they resist, we smash them. It's what the Israelis call mowing the lawn. Every couple of years, you massacre a few thousand people in Gaza. They'll learn the lesson. They'll be quiet. And if they try to resist, we just crush them. We oppress them. So that was the answer. And on the eve of October 7th, you'll remember Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Council, National Security Advisor, saying the Middle East region is more calm, more stable than it's ever been. Everyone was talking about, oh, we're going to have Saudi-Israeli normalization. Under the Trump presidency, you saw these Abraham Accords. And the idea was the Palestinians are insignificant. We can manage them. Israel's problem is resolved without having to give them their rights or recognize their resistance. And that was the approach. So post-October 7th, you do see Israelis saying, well, let's take the opportunity to finish the job of 1948, to expel the Palestinians, at least from Gaza. But we also see that escalating in the West Bank as well. I think that the Israelis who wanted to do that thought they would have been able to achieve that early on in this genocide. So far, they haven't, and Palestinians don't show any signs of wanting to leave. But that gives you the big picture, which is that Israel thought that it had defeated the Palestinians, made the issue go away.
So that gives some interesting background too to some of the news items we see. Nikki Haley writing "Finish the job" on missiles, or
finish them.
Yeah, right.
So real genocidal language.
Yeah. It seems unclear then what might come out of this. Do you see much debate going on in Israel today, or is there sort of a consensus that we just have to continue this war until total victory is ours?
There seems to be complete disarray and collapse within Israel on a level that we haven't seen. Now, as we're speaking, there's open squabbling in public between the army and the government. They don't know what the goals are. Israel has not achieved anything militarily in Gaza. Nothing. It has been defeated militarily in Gaza by the resistance. Of course, I'm not talking about mass extermination and genocide, because that's not fighting. Murdering men, women, and children by the tens of thousands, that's not fighting. Israel is always the best at that, the world champions at that. But what they haven't managed to achieve is to significantly degrade the ability of the resistance, to cause them extreme losses in an endless war of attrition, which is at this point already similar to the war of attrition that cost the United States a great deal in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so on, where 2, 3, 4 soldiers a day in a small country like Israel is very significant losses. And we're talking about thousands of soldiers with long-term injuries. And going back to a society that is in disarray and collapse, you may remember that in the 1980s and 1990s, when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, carried out horrific massacres and killed tens of thousands of people there, and then occupied the southern 15% of Lebanon's territory. And called it a security zone. They said, we're going to establish a security zone inside Lebanon, excuse me. Yeah. And of course, that was hell for the people of Lebanon until the resistance forced Israel to withdraw in 2000. Today, you could say the security zone is on the other side of the border. The fact that tens of thousands of Israelis have had to leave their homes in the north, along the border with Lebanon. Tens of thousands have had to leave their homes in the so-called Gaza envelope. These are kibbutzes and settlements built on the ruins of ethnically cleansed Palestinian communities around Gaza. All those people are now displaced, being kept in hotels, paid for by the government. The tourism industry has collapsed. Investment is collapsing. Intel, the chip maker, has just announced that it's pulling out of a $25 billion factory investment in Israel. And they said due to market conditions, which I think is a polite way of saying we'd be crazy to invest in that country or to put additional money into that country. And there's a massive brain drain and flight. Israelis who can get out are getting out. And so you have to think, in the best case, what are Israeli leaders offering the public there? In the best case, they're saying this war could go on for 10 years. And so if you look at this realistically from the perspective of an Israeli, you're in a small country with a collapsing economy that is constantly at war, that is increasingly isolated internationally. And what's the future? There isn't a future for Israel. I think that this genocide is hastening the end of this Israeli Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. And I think it's ending because, for it to succeed, it has to be a place for the settler colonial population that they want to live, that they feel secure. And, the cliche has always been Israel is the only safe place for Jews. Everyone in the world can see it's the most dangerous and unstable place in the world for Jews, who, for the most part, would be better off and would rather be in Europe, in North America, or in Australia, Canada, so on, New Zealand, countries where many Israelis are moving now, particularly to Germany, ironically, has a huge incoming Israeli population.
Yeah. It's time for me to bring my fellow panelists on board, Gary Burge, David Crump, Bruce Fisk, Rob Dalrymple. Welcome you all. And we'll open up conversation. I think Gary maybe has the next question.
Ollie, thank you very much for being with us in this conversation. We've been looking forward to it for a long time. It strikes me, Ollie, that in almost every war, one of the strategies of an opponent is to, I guess you might say, brutalize their enemy by portraying them as barbaric, as violent. And that's one way to justify their destruction. Well, you began to allude earlier to this very terrible day, October 7, and of course we don't want to bypass how horrible that was for Israel. But at the very same time, we also want to talk about the kinds of stories that circulated out of October 7 that attempt to portray Hamas in a way that was not exactly fair. So stories have circulated about everything from sexual violence to violence to fetuses, babies, et cetera, et cetera. Even our U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson repeated all of this in April, and it's very astonishing to hear these kinds of things reported in the New York Times and elsewhere. Now, you've actually engaged this whole subject, unlike many others, and maybe you could summarize for us, first of all, how has this kind of messaging worked in this Gaza war, and how did you reach the conclusion that so much of this is simply propaganda?
Those are great questions. Thank you, Gary. I mean, the first thing to say is what did happen on October 7th. There was a breakout from the besieged Gaza Strip, which has been under Israeli occupation for almost 60 years, a largely refugee population. For the last 20 years, it's been under a tight siege and repeated bombardment and massacres by Israel if the population there in any way tried to revolt against being in what is essentially a large open-air prison. And so the first thing to say is Palestinians have every right to resist that situation, a right enshrined in international law, and to use military means to do so. And on October 7th, that's what they did. And the targets of the Palestinian resistance, which is led by Hamas, but not only by Hamas, were primarily military targets. The Israeli so-called Southern Division or Gaza Division, whose bases are all around the perimeter of Gaza. They attacked them. They defeated the Gaza Division. They took its commanders prisoners. They took its soldiers prisoners. They killed many of its soldiers. That is the main story of what happened on October 7th. Hamas leaders have said civilians were killed on October 7th, but it wasn't our goal to go out and kill them. Our goal was to attack the Gaza Division. Immediately on October 7th, you got these stories of Hamas going into communities. These came from senior Israeli commanders and so-called rescuers, first responders, claiming all sorts of things happened that never happened. Babies being rounded up and burned and beheaded. Families being tied together and being burned and shot and beheaded. The story you alluded to of a fetus being cut out of a woman, all sorts of things that are absolutely atrocious and that were completely debunked. Some of them quite early on, the beheaded baby story. You'll recall that President Biden came out and said he'd seen the photos, and then the White House had to actually come out and walk that back and say, no one in the administration has seen any photos of that, not the president or anyone else. And these atrocity stories, and I'm going to come to sort of one of the big ones in a second, they served a number of purposes. One, as you mentioned, Gary, in war, demonizing the enemy is something that is done for a purpose, to facilitate killing them, to incite the population into being willing to kill them. And you'll see one of the early messages that Israel tried to push was that Hamas equals ISIS, which has no basis in reality whatsoever. But they tried to push that, and for that you need atrocity stories. You need something so horrible that anything is justified in response. And that was one of the purposes. The other was to distract from the military defeat Israel suffered, to distract from the fact that the Gaza Division, which had received also billions of dollars from the United States to have this sophisticated security fence and layered, perimeter around Gaza, totally failed within a few hours. They had failed on an intelligence basis because Hamas had been able to plan this, and they failed on the day when the Israeli resistance just melted away. Then you got the stories that Hamas, killed. First, they said 1,500 people, and we were told, civilians, children, women, people at this supernova festival. But then we started seeing the pictures. We started seeing the pictures which were on the front of the Washington Post, on CNN, and so on. And you look at these pictures and you say, wait a minute, there are dozens of incinerated cars with bodies that are incinerated beyond recognition. There are whole streets of houses in kibbutzes like Kibbutz Be'eri that are just flattened to the ground or completely burned out. There's destruction on a massive scale. And you say, how did Hamas do that with AK-47s? How did guys who came in on foot, on motorcycles, a few were on paragliders apparently, they didn't bring tanks with them. They didn't bring heavy artillery with them. They didn't bring 2,000-pound bombs with them. How did they do all this destruction? How did they incinerate all these cars? And you just realize, well, that just doesn't make sense. And then you started to get the testimonies from the survivors, the Israeli survivors, people like Yasmin Porat. She is a woman, an ordinary Israeli woman who was in Kibbutz Be'eri, which is one of the communities near the Gaza border. And she was taken captive by the Hamas fighters, her and her partner and a bunch of other people. And she told the story on Israel Radio, on Kan, the public broadcaster, on October 16th. So we're talking about 8-9 days. And this wasn't her first interview. She gave a number of interviews. And what we did at the Electronic Intifada, we took that entire interview with the audio, we translated it to English, we put it online, we wrote about it, just going from the Israeli sources. What did Yasmin Porat say? People can find this interview at our YouTube channel and at the Electronic Intifada. She said that once they were taken captive by the Palestinians, they were treated, in her words, humanely. That was her word. She said they treated us very humanely. And the interviewer, the Israeli interviewer, said, "What do you mean by that, humanely?" She said, "Well, they didn't hit us. They didn't threaten us. They let us drink. They let us have food. They reassured us. They told us very clearly, we're not going to kill you. All we want to do is take you to Gaza and then we'll release you. We just want our people to be freed." And she said it was fine. Everything was very calm. I mean, it's not a great situation to be in. I'm not saying that it was a picnic, but that's the situation she described until the Israeli army and security forces came in. And she said they just started shooting. And what we know is that in that particular incident in Kibbutz Be'eri, an Israeli tank was ordered by a brigadier general called Barak Hiram to open fire at that house where Yasmin Porat had been. She had gotten out of the house because one of the Palestinian commanders actually surrendered and took her out with him. And she said, I was telling the Israelis, you're going to fire a tank shell at the house? What do you mean? There's people in there. They said, oh, no, don't worry. We're just going to, bring down the walls. They fired the tank shells. They killed everyone in the house, including Yasmin Porat's partner, Tal Katz. The only other survivor is a woman called Hadass Dagan, and she told exactly the same story. What I'm telling you this story in some detail because they were the only two survivors, and there were something like 15 civilians in that house. And if they had not survived, no one would know how that went down because the Israeli army lied about it. Barak Hiram came out and claimed that they had rescued 4 people and that there was a bunch of children in the house and Hamas had killed them. None of that was true. None of that was true. And we also know from other Israeli accounts, from survivors and witnesses, that the Apache helicopters, US-supplied Apache helicopters, were firing indiscriminately. And we know, again, all from Israeli sources, that they applied something called the Hannibal Doctrine. This is an Israeli military doctrine that was established in the 1980s, but it was secret until 2014, which says that Israeli forces can use overwhelming force to stop an Israeli being taken captive, even if that means killing them. And they used the Hannibal Doctrine on October 7th. So what we did at the Electronic Intifada and a few other independent outlets is all, I want to say it's easy, but it's not that easy because it's still a lot of work, but it's not rocket science, let's say. We simply reported what Israelis were saying to each other in the Israeli media. And you could not find that in the New York Times, on CNN, in the Washington Post, in the Guardian, or in any of these other mainstream sources. You didn't see anyone else reporting what Yasmin Porat said in interview after interview consistently in the Israeli media. And then when it comes to the big story, the mass rapes, the claim that Hamas used sexual violence. This is a horrible thing to have to talk about, and I apologize in advance to viewers for having to delve into this. But those stories came out very early on. And this kind of rape story is common in warfare, where it's a common accusation, and it's now accepted that sexual violence and rape is also a common feature of warfare. But the question is, that doesn't tell you if it happened or not on October 7th. The Israelis said it happened. They described it in lurid terms. It was all over the media. But when we looked at it, in detail, which we started to do, we found that none of it held up. None of the eyewitness stories made sense. To this day, Israel has not identified one single victim, living or dead. Not one person who was credibly a victim of sexual assault has been identified. And I've had people come back at me and say, oh, well, you know, you don't expect them to go and give an interview before the world press. No, I don't. If there's a victim of sexual violence, they're under no obligation to go public or even give their name. But then you would expect at least credible sources, official sources, to say, yes, there are victims, and but they don't want to be seen. Or they don't want to be talked to, but they've given their accounts to the police. They've given their testimony to the police. To this day, the Israeli police say that they have not identified a single living victim. Well, the other line we get is, oh, well, they were all killed. I mean, first of all, how likely is that? They say that this was sexual violence on a massive scale, pervasive, ordered from the top, and it's not likely that every single victim was killed. That's just not likely. But even if it were true, there's no forensic evidence, none whatsoever. So we've had now multiple inquiries. We've had 2 UN inquiries. We've had the International Criminal Court. And, you know, it's hard to summarize this, but I'm going to try. We had a report by Pramila Patten, the UN Secretary General's special representative of sexual violence in conflict, that she issued in March. I was critical of that report for being too pro-Israel. But in a sense, she was bending over backwards to give credence to what Israel said, and she couldn't do it. She couldn't establish this story. She said, we got thousands of photos and videos from the Israelis. The Israelis claim they have 200,000 pieces of visual evidence from October 7th. Not one of them shows, in the words of that UN report, tangible evidence of rape or sexual assault. Not one piece of evidence. How is that when there's so much video on October 7th that not one of them shows these attacks which were happening everywhere? You've had Israeli security agencies telling Haaretz, the main newspaper there, that we do not have a single photo or video showing a rape taking place. Not one. You've had these lurid claims of sexual mutilation. The 2 UN reports, the first one I just mentioned, the second one, the Commission of Inquiry came out, said they have found no evidence of sexual or genital mutilation. Again, a pervasive claim. No forensic evidence. The second UN report affirms that as well. The International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, in his report accompanying his request for arrest warrants against 2 Israeli leaders and 3 Palestinian leaders, they reveal that they don't have any evidence that would stand up to scrutiny and allow them to bring charges related to rape on October 7th. And on it goes. The Israeli police said they've interviewed 3 eyewitnesses out of, again, we were told this was pervasive and everywhere, and they said in not one case could they match the eyewitness accounts to victims or bodies or locations or evidence. Not one case. Will you find any of this reported as I've just said it, citing the Israeli sources and citing the UN reports in the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, and so on? You will not. On the contrary, they continue to spread this propaganda. I've said on the Electronic Intifada live stream, consistently as we've covered this, we've done multiple episodes, so I'll refer people to our YouTube channel and our website for those. I've said then, I'll say again now, not only is there no evidence for sexual violence on a large scale as a weapon of war ordered by Hamas, which is the Israeli claim, but I have seen no credible evidence for even a single isolated sexual attack of this kind on October 7th. Not one. not one victim living or dead, not one credible eyewitness, no forensic evidence, and no other sorts of corroborating evidence such as DNA and so on.
Thanks, Ollie. It's a tough story, and I appreciate your candor. Because the story gets repeated again and again and again, it's almost impossible, it feels like, here in the West to put it out. My friend Rob here has got a question that wants to take us into another sad and, of course, tragic piece of this, and that is civilian casualties and how astonishing these have now become.
Yeah, and again, Ollie, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And we'll put links to your websites and your videos. Obviously, the Gray Zone has done some wonderful things on the rape allegations. And Mondoweiss, as well as Democracy Now! Has done some consolidation. So we'll put links to all that in the show notes there as well for everyone. But, I just did a live stream last week, and I had a couple of Jewish leaders and scholars on saying, Israel's the most moral army that's ever existed type of mantra. And the question was actually posed to me, what else is Israel supposed to do? They often cite John Spencer, the chair of urban warfare on Modern War Institute at West Point, who said, quote, "By my analysis, Israel's implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history, above and beyond what international law requires, and more than the U.S. did in Iraq and Afghanistan." So is Spencer correct? How do you respond to this?
I don't know how you respond to something like that. I mean, what these sorts of people are telling us is, don't believe everything you're seeing and hearing from, the horrifying videos that we're seeing every day of shredded bodies, of mass destruction, of mass graves. You're not supposed to believe any of that. You're not supposed to believe all the UN and international officials who are some of whom are in Gaza saying what's going on. You're just supposed to believe that Israel's assertions that it's the most moral army in the world. I mean, I don't want to get into a sort of a detailed argument with it because it's so absurd on its face. It's so outrageous to say such a thing. For Israel, killing civilians is the point. They have something called the Dahya doctrine, which they openly proclaim. This is a military doctrine that was first sort of codified in 2006 when Israel invaded Lebanon. Where does it get its name? The Dahya is the name of the southern suburb of Beirut, where it said, the resistance movement, Hezbollah, has, a strong popular support. It's a predominantly, many Hezbollah supporters live in that area. So because Israel was unable to defeat Hezbollah on the battlefield in 2006 and is unable to defeat the Palestinian resistance now, the Dahya doctrine kicks in, and it says that you go after the civilians, you destroy the housing, the infrastructure, you make the civilians suffer to impose such a high cost that the resistance will have to give up, that the population will turn against them. And you remember also at the beginning of this genocide, Israeli leaders saying our model is Dresden, our model is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You remember Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, saying that we're cutting off everything, food, water, fuel, medicine to the human animals. The Israelis made no secret that their target is the civilian population. They said it. When South Africa took its case to the International Court of Justice, they laid it all out in the in their filing, statement after statement from Israeli officials saying, yeah, we're going to make them suffer. We're going to make the civilians suffer. The wanton destruction that Israelis are proud of, that they're filming themselves, putting on TikTok, burning libraries, bombing and flattening universities. They've attacked every single hospital in Gaza. When they attacked the first one, the Al Ahli Baptist Hospital, they had to come up with an elaborate story. Oh, it was Palestinian rockets that did it, even though a Palestinian rocket had never killed so many people in history. But after that, they just attacked them openly. They put out on Twitter, on Israeli social media, this elaborate cartoon, this animation they'd created showing the multi-level bunker that was supposedly under the Al-Shifa hospital, that were with with just like this fantasy thing that they had, this Bond villain lair under El Shifa Hospital. Of course, none of that existed. But all of that was a pretext to destroy the civilian infrastructure in order to make Gaza unlivable. They did it openly. And anybody who claims otherwise is simply, I think, is knowingly trying to mislead people.
Ali, let's keep on that theme, but shift to the West Bank. There have been a lot of reports coming out of forcible transfer. B'Tselem's reporting on it, Haaretz, Jewish Currents. There's just been a number of people who have been evicted, somewhere around 1,000 from their homes in the West Bank due to settler violence and military action. There have been arrests, something like 9,000 West Bank Palestinians, including 300 women. Could you talk a little bit about the shift that's going on and the intensification, and even you can call it the retaliatory attacks taking place in the West Bank? Is Gaza a convenient distraction for action going on in the West Bank? Does Israel want to stir up another intifada?
The scale of the genocide in Gaza and its just unspeakable nature is such that it, speaking for us, for example, at the Electronic Intifada, our goal is to cover everything that's happening in Palestine. The reality is the scale of what's happening in Gaza absorbs so much of our time and attention and resources inevitably that it's easy to take our eyes off what's happening in the West Bank. And that's to say, if what was happening in Gaza wasn't happening in Gaza, what's happening in the West Bank would be the main story. Such is the escalation. I mean, prior to October 7th, Israel had already killed hundreds of people in the West Bank since the start of the year. The violence had been escalating. It's now, I think more than 600 killed in the West Bank since October 7th. Historically, that is an enormous number, and an acceleration of ethnic cleansing against various Palestinian villages like Ain Samia, which has been completely ethnically cleansed, a community of more than 1,000 people, and settler land theft and settler terrorism and vandalism against the Palestinian population. Remember, Israel's goal and the goal of the settlers, who are an arm of the government, they're fully backed by the government and the army. The effort to portray them as somehow rogue actors is just a complete fabrication. These people are an extension of the Israeli state, and they're only in the West Bank by virtue of the Israeli state. Their goal is to ethnically cleanse the West Bank. That's their goal. And they use a pseudo-biblical religious justification for it, but it's just outright land theft. And it has escalated since October 7th because there is just very little international accountability for Israel. There is immunity and impunity. And that's why it's escalating. And Israel has always been a master of what some call salami slicing techniques. So they don't take the whole thing at once. They go slice by slice by slice. They get you used to it. And that's what's going on in the West Bank. And it deserves a lot more attention and a lot more solidarity and support for the people there.
I was remiss in not introducing my colleague, Michael Thompson, but Michael has a question, takes in a slightly different direction.
Thank you.
Sure. Good to meet you, sir. Thank you for what you're sharing with us. There's a lot to process here. So on this question, it may be on a different scale, but let's see what you think of the student movement in the U.S. and in Europe and around the world. How do you weigh its efficacy? How do you weigh the impact it may be having? Is it a sideshow, or is it actually doing some good? And I know that it varies from campus to campus, and I'm not expecting a greatly detailed, but from 10,000 feet, how How would you assess the student movement's impact?
It's tremendously important. It's tremendously important. And it's not just me saying it. Our friends and colleagues, our loved ones in Gaza say it. They tell us that the protests on the campuses in particular, but all the protests, all the solidarity, no matter how large or small, is what's keeping them going. And I want to take this opportunity to convey that to people. Going out protesting, it is seen and heard in Gaza, but I think politically it is making a big difference, and it signals the kind of generational shift that we were talking about earlier. And I think it also, when you look at the extreme reaction of university administrations, of course, acting in cahoots with and at the behest of the government, you have to go back to the Vietnam era when you had the massacres at Kent State in Ohio and Mississippi State in Jackson State in Mississippi, to get to the level of brutality and repression. I was on a university student in the US in the late 80s and early 90s, when there was a lot of protests. There were encampments, what we called shanties, protesting apartheid in South Africa. There were protests and occupations protesting the US role arming death squads in Central America, particularly Nicaragua. There was a protest against having CIA and military recruitment on campus. There were several occupations of university administration buildings. There were protests and disruptions when President George H.W. Bush came and was given an honorary doctorate. That's to say, from my little slice of America at the time, I just moved back to the country very recently at that time, there was a lot of protest. Never once did the university call the cops on the students. I took part in unauthorized protests. The campus security would come, they'd have a quiet talk with you. No one was suspended. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was denied graduation. There weren't hearings in Congress to call us anti-Semites and terrorist lovers and I don't know what. The extremity of the reaction, I think, is significant because it points to a ruling class and establishment that feels that it's losing its grip and that is completely out of touch with how people feel. And so the protests started on US campuses, they spread to Europe, they spread to other countries. Again, that shows a real impact of these protests. And of course, we're not just talking about campus protests, they're all important. But yes, I think it signals a generational shift, and it's why there is such panic and effort now by Israel lobby groups like the Anti-Defamation League to try to get students and student groups investigated as providing material support to terrorism because they're protesting against the genocide. Absolutely absurd stuff. But the level of repression is a signal of the level of fear they have, that they're losing their grip.
I'll let my colleague move on. I could have a follow-up because there's a lot there, but there's only so much time. So,
yeah, David, I think.
Did he just freeze? There he is.
There he is.
Yeah. Ollie, thank you again for being with us today and talking to us. In both your books, One Country and The Battle for Justice in Palestine, you argue for both the necessity and the possibility of one democratic state in the land of Israel-Palestine. Can you please explain what this means for Israeli Jews and for all Palestinians living in the land today? And have the Hamas attack on October 7 and Israel's subsequent attack on Gaza made a single democratic state more or less likely?
That's such a good question, and we actually need a whole hour to discuss that question at least. So I think I won't do it justice, but I'll try very briefly. You know, in my first book, One Country, where I make this argument and lay out what I hoped would be a very attractive vision, I also warned in that same book that Israel is capable of genocide. And that was almost 20 years ago. I I think Palestinians generally understand that Israel is genocidal. We always have, even if people didn't believe us. I think where I was wrong, and many of us were wrong, is we thought that even if Israel had the will and ability to commit genocide, we had this belief that the world will never allow it. We were wrong about that. The world did allow it and is allowing it. And when it comes to the United States, is facilitating and aiding and abetting it. But so I don't think I was naive in setting this vision out. But what I hoped would be sort of a best case scenario would be some kind of relatively non-violent transition a la South Africa. South Africa defied the worst expectations in terms of a bloodbath in which hundreds of thousands or millions of people would be killed at the end of apartheid. That's not to say it's been an easy road since then. That's another topic as well. But that's what I hoped would be the best case scenario. Unfortunately, it went towards the worst case scenario. I think I would say now that I do not think Israel has a future. I think that this project is over. I think that it will become a single Palestinian state from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. That doesn't mean all Jews will leave. I think that a lot will choose to leave because their interest in remaining there is as masters and rulers, not as equal citizens. But I think those who don't want to leave or can't leave will find that they can live there with the Palestinian people under a democratic regime of self-determination for Palestinians, and not a colonial regime of Zionist Israeli domination and rule. It's very hard to think ahead to that in the middle of a genocide. It's not easy to even vision or imagine that. But you know, the genocide, I think, has convinced people across the region that you know, even if we entertain the idea of some kind of political settlement with Israel that would allow it to remain, I think people are saying this thing can't remain as it is. It's too dangerous. It's too deadly. It now has committed genocide on a scale like we didn't imagine. I don't think people have absorbed that necessarily in the US and the West, that there can be no future for a regime that perpetrates genocide. That doesn't, just to be clear, that doesn't mean there's no future for the people in that state, but they are a highly propagandized population, one that overwhelmingly supports this genocide, and they will need to be, I don't know what the term would be, de-Zionized, some process that Germans were supposed to have gone through after World War II, but maybe not so successfully, given how Germany is supporting this genocide. But something has to be done to remove this deadly ideology and allow them to live as normal people with Palestinians, if that's what they choose to do.
Can I just jump in with a 2-second question? What sort of mental timeline do you see for that exercise in political future? When you just referred to Germany, the U.S., France, the far right is on a Western ascendancy,
yeah,
in such a way that would undermine the pressure needed from the West, at least.
Well, that brings us to a bigger question, which we don't have time to go into, but I think is worth alluding to, which is that Israel as a settler colonial project is fundamentally tied to the West and its history and present of colonial and imperial domination. I just think we have to understand that that's how the world has been organized for centuries, with the West and in the last century, the United States as the dominant imperial hegemon. And that world is now changing. US power is diminishing. My friend Professor John Mearsheimer talks about this a lot, and many very very informative lectures and podcasts that people can find online, and others do too. And it's not a world the US can order about anymore. And so the diminishing of, I used to think that, I think many of us used to think that there would only be change in Palestine, there could only be justice when the United States changed, when enough people in the United States were convinced of the need for justice. That's still important. I'm not saying we should give up that work at all. But I think what's likely to be a bigger factor is simply the decline of the United States. In other words, relatively speaking, the irrelevance of the United States on the world stage, which means that what Americans think just won't matter as much, because China, Russia, India, Brazil, a whole world that is fed up of this current global order is rising, and it's rising economically, politically, culturally, and so, in a sense, the rise of the far right, or the Western ascendancy, is, I think, the last gasps of Western ascendancy as much as anything else. Now, I just want to say, does that mean, that's looking ahead to X number of years? It may be in the near future, it may be the further future, but right now the United States is the determining factor in this genocide. The United States is the only country that could single-handedly stop it if they wanted to. And I don't want to lose that point, because people need to keep up the pressure in every way they can. I think someone's supposed to
Ross, we can't hear you. Try it again, Ross. No. How about if I'll go ahead and jump in, Ross, and take your last question. Ali, again, thank you so much for your time. You stayed extra long. We really, really appreciate that. But the final question we really want to ask, our audience is a uniquely American Christian audience, which I don't think you speak to a whole lot, and we appreciate you doing so. So do you have a message for us in particular, for our audience in particular? And secondly, what frustrates you the most about reporting on Gaza and the West Bank to a Western audience?
Yeah. Well, what I would like to say is, don't believe a lot of what you're told, because there is an effort to tell American Christians that what is happening in Palestine is a religious or civilizational conflict, that there is an implacable enmity between Jews and Christians on the one hand against Muslims, that Hamas and Palestinians in search of some are on some religious mission instead of simply trying to liberate their homeland. And all of these things are not true. I would say listen to Gary Burge, who's written a wonderful book debunking Christian Zionist theology, which some, my friend Don Wagner calls heresy. I'm going to tread on territory that is not my field. I'm not a theologian, but listen to those people within your own community and traditions who have studied this deeply and who understand what's going on. And remember too that if Palestine is the birthplace of Christianity and the birthplace of Jesus in the Christian tradition, the first Christians were Palestinians, and today there are still Palestinian Christians in Palestine and in Gaza who have suffered tremendously. They are the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world, and they deserve and need your solidarity, but all Palestinians do. You will hear Palestinian Christians saying, our struggle, our place, our situation is the same as our Palestinian Muslim brothers and sisters. And that's true. And Palestinian Muslims will tell you that there's no difference between us and Palestinian Christians. These are, there are no divisions there among Palestinians. These are narratives imposed from the outside to try to set people against each other. So I'd also like to say that over the decades that I've been doing this kind of work, some of the most resonant prophetic voices, some of the truest people who have stood with Palestinians, beside Palestinians, sometimes in front of Palestinians, shielding them from the bullets and bulldozers of the Israeli occupation forces, have been Christians acting out of their Christian faith and belief and conviction. So for those who are looking at this for the first time, or for whom the horror of the genocide in Gaza is awakening them to something, I would say thank you for listening, and please listen more. There's a lot more to listen to. And go out and stand in solidarity with Palestinians, all Palestinians. We need you, and your voices matter. And just to say that I've found that when I have had the opportunity to go and speak in Christian congregations and communities around the country, I've found that that spirit is very much there, but people have just not been given the information and the opportunity. And that's why I think a discussion like this, and I hope it gets heard and seen widely, and the others you're doing in this series get heard and seen widely, are so tremendously important.
Ali, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom. You've given us a lot to think about. When we say goodbye to you, the rest of us will stay on and have a debrief if folks want to stay tuned. But we are really grateful for you. Again, just to give you a shout out to the Electronic Intifada.net. And we look forward to your continued reporting and analysis. Thank you for being so generous with us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali.
Bye-bye.
All right.
Are we on?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, we're good. That was powerful. Who wants to go first?
Hey, Ross, did you figure out what happened on your audio?
I think USB-A is not playing nice with USB-C, is not playing nice with my microphone. Sorry about that, but
that's fine.
No, I mean, it's figuring it out is the trick, you know?
Yeah. And I'm sorry for the loud typing as well.
That's okay.
Help.
We still got a number of viewers that are still with us. Thank you so much for staying with us, guys. And I want to encourage you again, as Ross said at the beginning, to subscribe to our YouTube channel to find out about upcoming events. We have some more events planned for the month of July. Follow us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok to kind of keep up with what's going on. But does one of you want to start first, kind of with your thoughts? Let's keep them brief. Again, we've gone long as well. So go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, sure. So Ali is a gem. He's very straightforward. I'll just make a couple of observations. One, it came through clearly, I think, that the strength of some of their reporting is that they really just go to the Israeli media and report from there stories and voices that, the West just doesn't pick up. And that underscores the gap between East and West, or between Israel and the Western corporate media. So that came through loud and clear for me. Another theme that I heard from him that I'm hearing and reading elsewhere these days is this notion that Israel doesn't have a future. It's somehow self-immolating, and it's only a matter of time before the system breaks down. I'm a little less. I'm a little more skeptical about that, but I have no expertise in that area. And two more things real quick. One, in this conversation, there was almost no critique or assessment of Hamas's behavior. with a few passing comments. So I think that could be a criticism. On the other hand, that's kind of, we brought him on to talk about his stuff and his work.
Yeah.
So, but that was an omission. And then just finally, the framing of settler colonialism is something I'm still working through myself. He uses that language. A lot of other people do. Certainly, colony was the language used by the early Zionists colonizing. They settled, but there's some senses in which I think settler colonialism does and doesn't apply in this situation. So it's just one of those trigger words now. Sometimes get down conversations, and I'm just flagging it as something I'm still kind of pondering.
Bruce, I can't wait to see you ponder that eventually in articles or books, but because I'd like to hear where that thought takes you.
Somebody else want to add something here briefly?
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
The Canadian wants to defer naturally here. The discussion around sexual violence and war was very, very informative. One of the say to this for the sake of the recording and anyone else who's still watching, the risk of having 7 men of a certain age talk about sexual violence optically and minimally be sensitive that it's not a dismissal. He didn't, if I'd had a chance for a follow-up question, I might have pressed him a little bit just to say, are we, propaganda aside, and there's a ton of propaganda. He does a great job breaking that down on his own, on the Intifada, Electronic Intifada website. I've watched a lot of it. Propaganda aside, it's almost inevitable that there would be some violence, possibly including sexual violence in times of war. So we shouldn't pretend, going a bit to what Bruce was saying about Hamas, lily whiteness on, is a risk that you should be careful not to project, or you lose some credibility. And I think we wrestle with that collectively, exactly where to draw that line as we wrestled with what is real and true in this. So that's it for me.
I appreciate you naming that, Michael. I think we all share that sense of discomfort. And one of the difficulties in the strategy of saying it's all or nothing is that you run the risk of being refuted when new evidence turns up. As much as I've read and listened to Ali on this question, he does seem to have a very, very strong counter argument to the claim that Hamas intended to use this as a weapon on October 7th. We've seen comments that's been printed different places attributed to Sinwar, the military leader of Hamas, saying, there were people that got involved that did stuff we weren't planning. So the room in that kind of chaos for many things to happen.
Ali is an amazing propaganda buster. That's his strength. And I learned so much from him by going to his website and even today. So he's definitely worth attending to.
But boy, to the extent that that women, children, non-combatants were brutalized in a variety of ways, that's true, and we grieve for that.
Right.
And, the narrower point is perhaps worth making, that we don't want to idealize either side in this terrible conflict.
Yeah, Gary, you got something to add?
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things I like about Ali is he's a master of all these details. He lives this issue, and therefore he can cite to you, name, date, place, person, just offhand. So it's really delightful to listen to him speak. I think one of my frustrations is that we hear all of this sort of information. Then tomorrow I might have a conversation with someone who's a pastor in a church, and their minds are filled with all of the mythologies which surround this war, which surround Israel, and like Israel being the greatest nation on the army on the world, and this kind of thing, or having sort of a divine right to do what they're doing, and. Yeah, it's we talk about October 7 in these conversations so much about the horrible things that Hamas did, and yet no conversation about 36 or 37,000 people who died. So I don't know. I mean, I wish there would be a way that maybe we could take some of this stuff and import it into the church.
Yeah.
I wonder sometimes if people in the church are sort of ready-made not to accept it, to resist it. So in a densely propagandized environment, like most wars are, how do you break through so people can perhaps see a different perspective?
Yeah.
I find that really challenging.
I think, Gary, you're right. I think when you say that, I think evangelical and beyond Western Christians have been propagandized from childhood on this. And I know I was. Not in the sense that they had it out so much for the Palestinians per se, but so much as this fits with their view of how it's all going to come together. And what's lost in the equation is Christian ethics, love your neighbor, and all sorts of things.
Yeah, I heard, I've listened to him a lot. I've watched a number of his live streams and paid attention to some of the information that you get from him. And I really appreciated his time, his graciousness, and coming on and joining us. Yeah, and one of the things I thought was, we have to hear the voices from the other side. There were things like that he said that I wouldn't have said it that way, or I wouldn't have said it that extremely. But that doesn't mean that I have the right to kind of criticize him because he's in a different context. I just think it's important for that voice to be amplified. And sure, we are in agreement that we condemn what Hamas did as well. But we have this audience that often has this one side of the narrative, and we're trying to bring them the other side of the narrative. And we hope that if you're watching us, that you'll continue to listen, and you'll continue to listen to kind of all the different sides there. And hopefully adopt a Christian ethic and a Jesus ethic that simply says, for the sake of everyone, let's stop this madness. Let's stop this war. Let's stop this violence. Let's find a way to have peace and justice for everyone. And I do fear that this is going to be the end of Israel. And I do think that is something that's a reality there. And I thought it was interesting that he said that. So
we did it the same thing last thing. So that's interesting.
Yeah. We just want to thank everyone for tuning in. I appreciate this. We will have more events like this coming up in the next few months. And if you want to send us notes in terms of who you'd like to see, we'd love to hear from you as well. But we want to thank everyone for tuning in and for your time. So we appreciate everybody. So thank you so much.
Thank you.